My name is Richard McCoy. I'm an assistant conservator of objects here, and I'm thrilled to be sitting with Robert Irwin in front of the IMA's new sculpture, Light and Space 3, that was just finished.
Which is not an object.
Which is not an object. Okay. That's a great way to start. So it falls under my responsibilities because I take care of things here that are basically they're three-dimensional. So I take care of things that are not paintings, not works of art on paper. And so to me this falls as a kind of sculpture. But I'd be interested to hear how you define it. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to maybe just start at kind of a top level to talk about the context of the space, and then to have you describe what the piece is, and then move from there to talk about what are the materials in the piece, and then to give myself and then future IMA staffers an understanding of how we can maintain this piece and how to preserve its integrity and to preserve all of your intentions as to what it should be. And so...
Okay. So, first when I said that it wasn't an object, yeah. I think the sort of essential thrust of what I do now, because I started out as a painter, and I did make objects at one point, but the thrust of it is that it starts out that there's a certain kind of logic that allows us to frame our intentions, our activities, and it's a quantitative process having to do with identifying those kinds of critical pieces of information on a meaning structure, and on the basis of that we can make the object as an object. The man on a horse in the middle of a plaza who saved the city, right. Great meaning. He becomes central to that, and basically the plaza is around him. Right. Over in the recent history of modern art, that we've been breaking down that meaning structure, and we arrive at a certain point where, just as a kind of step by step, where the object became, in a sense, rather than sight dominant, it became sight conditioned in a way where it, I mean, it shouldn't say conditioned, sight, I don't know what, I've forgotten the word, but...
specific or? No,
not yet. That's the next step. It would be like a Marc de Souveraud, say, mm-hmm. Which is made in the studio, right. Still an object in the original sense, but when it's put in for this plaza, maybe makes it a little taller, right. Makes it green instead of blue or whatever. Right. And that was a step in which the site and the object begin to become interactive. Right. The next step is what they called site-specific. Richard Serra might be a good mm-hmm. situation in that. Mm-hmm. And the thing there is that it's made specifically for that site and theoretically is not movable. Right. Doesn't go anyplace else easily. Serra's
its meaning would change.
Yeah, its meaning would change. Well, to some degree. Okay. The thing, I mean, Serra does move them on occasion, right. But right. That's sort of the intention of it. I'm moving the next step, which would be to say that something is site conditional. That is, there are a set of conditions that exist that make every site, every place in the world, everything, there's no universal ideal place. There are places, and they're all different, and they are understood differently. For example, to say the scale of something is understood not just by standing in the space, but what you walk through to come to the space. Scale in New York, to walk into a room is one thing, mm-hmm. Scale in Wyoming is something else altogether, right. Okay? So in New York it may seem like a huge space to leave empty. In Wyoming it's just, no big deal, okay? Right. So every site has a set of conditions, and everything that exists bears on the history of the site, the use of the site, how and which way, as I say, you come to it. All this, in a sense, counts. This is essentially a very unique site. This is not something you're going to find anyplace else in the world. Not a set of conditions that will be repeated. Right. In fact, when I was brought to this site, I was a little depressed by it first, because that was the reason I was brought here, is that everybody here was very unhappy with this thing. It was not working. It was dim and sort of morose and mm-hmm. What have you. And at first, I had no idea what I would do it. But everything that I've done is conditioned by this site. I mean, it's something I came out of what happens here and how you might experience this thing. So you're not going to see this anyplace else in the world.
Yeah.
So that it's a, and what's also crucial to it is that someone coming to look at, say, the Richard Serra still understands it or processes it by thinking about the history of art, i.e. leading him to that moment, and why and how what Serra fits in that context. And the second is the history of Richard Serra. So you look at it on both these levels, and that's how you process, I like it, I don't like it, it's a good Serra, it's a better one, it's an extent, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Right. What I would propose is that in a situation like this, you really don't have to know anything about the history of art or necessarily about me. You look at the space, you knew this space, you understand what it was, you understand all the transfers. You say, well, I would have done this, it's interesting, or I would have done it differently, I would have done, in other words, you process it within the context by processing it with and against all the same cues that I use. In other words, I didn't sort of bring something to this per se, I sort of grew out of it, okay? The escalators being a classic example. I love the fact they're an integral part of the thing. It was one of the unique elements in the room, and in the beginning I didn't know how, but actually managed to take advantage of, which I think activates the thing in a really interesting way. It makes a very, not a static, but a rather interactive. Plus you can walk through it yourself and go up the escalators. So it's, it is like the key here is it's unique to this situation. Right. Some of the reasons why I did the things I did was one of the room was very dark, somewhat, I think they'd planned that the skylight would actually make it a lively space. Turned out it wasn't enough light really for it. Right. And so the space had a kind of dark, dingy sort of quality to it. So light seemed to be something that was really necessary in here. Well, you know, what do? Clean the skylight, change the level of filtration on it. Right. It's a possibility, you know, because it's a big item in here. Yeah. But not really in a sense, that's the kind of thing that the janitor could do, you know, clean the skylight. But so it's not quite in the Provence of what I do. And the second thing was that I think one of the things that bothered everybody here was the sort of Danish modern wood striping on the sides. It seemed out of context, really. It had no other reference in the place. And it was not a very successful solution at all. So there was a couple of issues there that I thought had to be dealt with. Right. And obviously the light element was, that's where it came from. I like the pattern that I have because it isn't object-like. You don't find yourself focusing on it. It doesn't read in any way. In fact, one of the problems that people have to some degree is they keep wanting to read in it, like there's stories in it or messages or symbols or signs. I like it. It's very neutral. It has none of that. It becomes a sort of mesmerizing sense of the whole. Obviously, the use of the scrim is by degrees to take this light and you see it on one level and then you see it through the scrim and then you see the wood sort of through the scrim and then finally becomes almost opaque on the outside. Right. So it was a way of dealing with just exactly the problems that existed there. Right. So everything came from looking at that situation. I looked at all the other parts of the room. There were always opportunities, but nothing that really presented itself having any kind of power. The third thing was that this is supposed to be sort of what is the Grand Hall or the
Great Hall.
The Great Hall.
Right.
Okay, Great Hall. And when you enter the museum, there's a kind of entrance. It's downstairs. You come up the escalator. There's there's a desk there, a little bit of a no man's land, but could be thought of as a second entrance in a way. And then theoretically, this Grand Hall, which was in a way sort of the focal point of the museum, wasn't the focal point of the museum. Right. So that was one of the responsibilities that whatever you put in here needed to do. It needed to address that and be strong enough and have a scale so that it became the Grand Hall, you know, and that's, I think, it does. I mean, it's got a monumental scale to it. So, and it has a power to it. So in a funny way, even though you go through those, this could be almost now figured as at the moment, the key moment of entry into the museum proper. You know?
It's one of the. you know, there's a couple introductions to to art when you get here, but this is certainly the biggest, most, you know, a very strong introduction to.
Well, like I say, it's confusing that there's more than one entrance, and you know, it needed to kind of organize itself, and that was a result of the fact that the museum is an add-on.
Right. And there are different ways you can come to this space. You can come up sort of the main ticketed entrance, and then you can come up these escalators here, come out there. You can actually even come from that side too. So this really is the center of the institution.
It is. I mean, ideally, when you look at it, and when you actually start looking at the art, this is the center, and you keep coming back into it and going back out of it. So this had a big responsibility in a way.
And it was such a big space, and it was so, in a way, empty. I remember joking with someone that, you know, the only thing that could fill this space would be putting a battleship on end. You know, it just needs something that was so big. But, you know, this clearly isn't a battleship, but the space now is full.
Has the same scale.
Right.
You know, yeah, it's a scale that matches the set of circumstances. And anything small down in here could be nice, but it wouldn't accomplish what we're talking about.
Right.
And so that's how it came about.
Great. So I wonder if we could talk through sort of the specific details that comprise the structure. I know them reasonably well. There's 160 light fixtures here.
Is that right?
Yeah, and most of them are the 2-foot pieces, and some of them are the 4-foot pieces.
Right.
And I know that you laid this design out at home and made a kind of design for it. And then on each side we have, depending, somewhere between 50 and 55 feet of stretched scrim material.
The pattern of it, in a sense, became square, vertical, because of the fact of the escalators. They normally, I think, I would have rotated them. It made them more active. But actually, because those things are going through it, they create the foil for the square to play against the angles.
Now that I think about that, the one in San Diego, that had angles in it.
It was all in it. Take the same thing, just rotate it, you know, 45 degrees and everything, and that's what gave it more energy. And this was squared up because the energy comes from, you know, it plays against the elements in there, which is the escalators.
Right.
And the light itself, I like a lot, and that's one of the things we're discussing right now about in terms of maintenance. There's the story is, I don't know if it's true, but it has a ring of truth to it, and that is that I always wondered why nobody made a really 54, 52 Kelvin light, a really white light.
Right.
All these big companies all made it, they call it daylight and it was blue, and they'd call it cool white and it was actually warm, yellowish. And it turns out, I was told that a very eccentric man owns the patent on it.
Right.
And just simply would never give it to Sylvania or GE or any of those.
And so the way that I understand they arrive at those color temperatures is by mixing the different phosphors inside the lamps, and then this produces a spectra in a color temperature, which is we talk about in Kelvin. And so you've made very specific decisions about the color of the 2-foot lamps.
I really like the idea of a completely neutral color. Okay. I mean, really just daylight in a way, or pure white light. And so we bought these things are actually manufactured now in Thailand. I guess he's given them the the right to make these things in a way.
And so then, but you liked the 4-foot. That one, Sylvania has made one, you know, as a 4-foot one, and you like that.
Now Sylvania makes a 4-foot one that's near or close.
Right.
It's actually a little more red in it. It's a little pinker,
right.
But it's not so much so that it becomes a focal point that you cognate on that.
So was that an idea that you would have in an ideal situation? Would they both be the same?
Oh, of course.
Okay.
I mean, if Fight doesn't make a 4-footer,
right.
Okay. Sylvania right now doesn't make a 2-footer.
Right.
So you're kind of twixt in between. The scrim material is a material that I found, 40 years ago, just walking down the street in Holland and in Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. They make a big thing about windows in Amsterdam. It's a kind of fetish with them. And on almost every window when you looked in, there was this material, this sort of gossamer material, which was very, beautiful, the way it played with the light, what it did with the light. And I was very, I'm always looking at things like that and say, God, that's really great looking. So I inquired about it, and it turns out that they make it 13 feet 9 1/4 inch wide, which is spectacular. And it's an extremely durable material. It has a lock weave to it, so if you were to cut it, it doesn't unravel. It's total synthetic, but I've never seen the loom, but it must be an incredible loom. And it's all made in the same part of the world. It's all made in Lyon, France. So I ran it down, found the material, started playing around with it, and I like it really well. It depends on the circumstances, but if you put it up in certain, like say on this hallway here, with light being equal in front and back of it, some people would walk right into it. Yet it diffuses what you're seeing just enough to put it. What it does is take everything else out of focus and leaves what isn't behind it in focus. So there's this real perceptual issue that it works, and it's a good material to. I wanted to deal with two things. One, I don't know if you know, but that first panel there of scrim, that was actually the wood striping.
Right, it came all the way out to there.
I made it wider because obviously it was a little too narrow to get the kind of scale that this thing needed. I took the granite, which I really liked, and broke it down and created that space, that width of it there. I also think that it made the granite work better because it was kind of, as beautiful as it was sort of ponderous in the room. It was the character of the room where it was. So to cut that down, I think, was a big improvement. And then by making it, you've got clear, then you have slightly translucent, then it gets more opaque as it goes. So it sort of like frames the thing. Interesting enough, having just seen it now today or yesterday, it looks like it's always been there. I mean, it doesn't look gerrymandered or stuck in there. It looks like that's how it was meant to be.
The same with this triangular piece up at the top is that I don't think anyone will ever realize that's a new piece.
Right. No, you
wouldn't. We built that here for your work.
Well, the triangle was a nice item in there, and really accentuated what the escalators were already doing. To bring it forward actually frames the inside when you're up there, and also
it's fascinating space inside.
It's better. Also, it's fun that it's interactive. That you do go up the escalators. You see people going up the escalators. So the thing is active on that level.
They move through it.
And when you get on this level, because the lights are on two planes, as you walk along, it looks like it's shifting. It does this so the whole thing has a kinetic quality about it without being self-conscious about it. In fact, there was a period of time when several people, I think a guy named Ricky was the most famous, did these kind of kinetic sculptures, but they were self-consciously kinetic. They were a little corny, actually. I like this roll because it's kinetic, but it's self-effacing. You don't focus on that I made the thing kinetic. It is kinetic, just by its use. So that's kind of a nice, it's several sort of add-ons that I had not really expected this kinetic as much as it was. Doing these things, whenever I do them, you're trying to kind of capture the phenomena of the place, i.e. in this case, say for example, people going up and down the escalators and what have you. And the fact that when you walk here, it does it. You're trying to capture that, but you never can quite predict how or in what way or to what degree that'll happen. You kind of say, well, I think, this is a possibility, and you try and make judgments and decisions, but I never know till I see them, and then you walk in and say, oh my God, usually if you capture it all, it does more than you ever thought about, and does things that are really terrific, and that they are almost subliminal to it. It's like, you see something happen and it's really interesting, like say the kinetic sculpture, but you recognize how it's done. It's like seeing the magician's hands. And so the beauty is that when you capture this phenomena, it all starts working for you, but it's also very, mysterious and rich and sort of, coming from all the different directions rather than being specifically there. It's a good game.
Yeah, when you were talking about moving through it, I was reminded of some of the decisions that were being made around the work and how the museum had a kind of influence in the way that it came to be. And what I mean specifically is that in the escalators, we asked to have those in the escalator well, those lights shifted up a little bit because we were concerned people might bump into them. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, or how you feel like that affected the piece, or if that...
It didn't ruin it.
Okay.
Okay.
Glad to hear that.
I don't know that it added anything particularly. You know, it's, I did a garden, the Getty, Central Gardens. And for example, at one point I put a stream, there was a fall line on the property, and the natural place for the stream. And the natural thought would be that you'd walk down along the edge of the stream. That's how you usually experience the stream. Then along came the handicap people, and they said, you can't do that because we can't walk down, it's too steep, etc. And at first I sort of riled against that because, you know, that's the natural thing I've been doing for thousands of years, you know, why can't we do that? And, you know, and aren't we being dictated to, blah, 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 and all that. And so finally, it's, you know, that's the way it is. So I ended up making this exaggerated zigzag path, which is the last thing I would have ever thought to do. And it turns out it's 10 times better. It really makes the thing, it creates a kind of mesmerizing. You pass in and out over the stream. Each time you cross over, the stream has a different character, a different quality, different sound. So then I've tuned all those things. And it also makes the time that it takes to get down there enough. If it's a small property, if you'd gone straight and down, it would have been over with too quickly, you know? And so the thing about working in the conditions is that it forces you, all these things that come to bear on it, you know, economic, physical, social rules, laws, the handicap issue in this particular case, they force you to have to think, in other words, completely think outside the box, to rethink, reconsider, and try and somehow turn what was theoretically a negative to start out with into a positive. And when you do, it's great because it's a total surprise. You think, oh, you know, like I said, this path is terrific. You know, it just made it. And same thing here. In this particular case, moving it up didn't hurt anything. I don't think that it necessarily improved anything, but it didn't hurt anything.
Right. So I'm interested in further sort of narrowing it down into the specifics. So when we installed all of the fixtures, obviously it's important to have all of the, you know, the wiring, all of that hidden, and to have them at the very specific angles that you've outlined. And that's a pretty straightforward thing. I mean, what to me was a little less straightforward is when we worked with Jeff Jameson for the past couple weeks to get the scrims up and to get them to read as planar. So it's a really challenging thing to stretch an enormous piece of fabric and to not get any waves in it, to not have any errors. It's a really complicated thing, which you know that. I
did it for years.
Right.
As of about 2 years ago, I worked with Jeff James helped me on a very big one. And he, you know, at this point, having done it for a lot, he's better at it than I am now. He's fussier, he's more particular about it. And so this particularly challenging one because of the height. I mean, you're working up at 60 feet in the air. But the material's very good. In terms of maintenance, this material's probably not going to be affected at all for, I don't know how many years, but I've seen it up 2 and 3 years in a situation. It doesn't shrink and doesn't expand with heat and temperature change and humidity. It does, of course, like anything, it will collect dust and whatever. But it can be dusted, and it can get soiled. Although probably it won't not much in here.
We have a pretty clean place.
Yeah, you don't have a lot of you don't have a kitchen putting grease up in the air. But so, and if it did, it can be washed in place, and so the maintenance of it, I have no idea how long under these conditions, but I would say you're not going to have to touch it for a minimum of 5 years. And if you do, what you'll do is just restretch it. You know, just take it down and start from scratch and restretch it. I don't even think it'll be that often. I actually think you're going to have, it's going to be a long time, because you're not going to see, this is not a dusty place. It's not a dirty place, so it's not going to be collecting a lot of stuff.
One of the things that when we were installing it, we started with this panel here, and I think Jeff wanted to start at the outside panel, but we didn't have the materials ready, so we started on this one. And so we put this one up, and when we first did it, we noticed we had a lot of these sort of waves in it. And you can pick these up really easily. because of the raking light. It's a diffuse light, but it eventually puts raking light on there.
Raking light reveals all sins.
It does. And so, so we got this one up, and then we did this one, and then we came over here and did this one. And by the time we got here, we were pretty good at it. We were a lot better than what we had started. And Jeff, I don't know if you know this, but he made the decision to actually take that one down.
Oh, I know. We discussed every night.
Yeah, and because he wasn't satisfied with the waves.
That's why I'm satisfied with Jeff.
Yeah, and so we put that one back up, and there's a lot, we've absolutely fine-tuned the technique of stretching and stapling. But I wonder if you have any, but when if you really look, you can see some kinds of the waves in there, but I wonder if you could comment on that.
There's one of the reasons why I like having Jeff do it is that when you're making something, you're really into it, at this level, you're working at it. The thing about the viewer coming in here, and it has to do with all the kind of details, you stand there and it happens. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it's sort of overall, very kinetic, as we talked about. If, for example, there's a mistake in there, mm-hmm. and every time while you're doing it, bang, you end up looking at the mistake, then you got to correct it. Because it's entered into now the whole process, and it's become a distraction. Right. In this situation, you stand here now, there are no problems that in any way whatsoever do that. Right. And so there are, if you were to look at it as a technician, like right now they're talking about closing a gap on the side that pulled apart. In terms of the piece, it doesn't, it's not an issue. Right. In terms of just everybody's sensibility, it's a good thing. You finish it, you clean it up. Right. You do all those details as well as you can do them. And in cases like that part, what they're doing now, basically that should be just straightforward. Mm-hmm. It's straightforward meaning you're doing something, it's going to cause to pull these things together. The idea that the element looks like it pulls them together, not a problem. In other words, you don't have to mask. You can mask it, that'll work also, but you don't have to really, because it essentially is it's like an honest thing. There's an honesty in materials, mm-hmm. and you see what they do, and when they do it really well, they're acceptable. In this particular case, none of that even enters in here.
Right. And I'd love to hear you talk about the honesty of materials, because one of the very fine details of this is that you can see all of the exposed staples. And a lot of people, they come around to see it for the first time, they get up right on it and they look at the staples and they say, oh, are these to be covered? And Jeff has always said, no, that's the way it is.
I've used this material before. Over the years, I tried covering them every way possible.
Right.
Nothing improved it. Nothing made it better. And actually, when you're standing there, just looking at it, viewing it, not inspecting it, but in viewing it, they're not an issue. Right. You don't really see them at all, And also, but Jeff being, I'm saying he being, after a number of years, maybe I'm not as insistent as he would be now. I love the fact that, man, he puts them in there very orderly.
Right.
They're not here, there, and everything. To put that many staples, I don't know, thousands of.
I think we estimated 15,000.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
and to do them all really as neatly as he's done them.
It takes great concentration and great effort.
Yeah, it takes dedication. He's that kind of a guy, and a sweetheart at the same time.
No, absolutely.
He's the guy to work with.
Yeah, he called me yesterday to kind of touch base to see how it's going.
Oh yeah. Well, one of the nice things, going back to the materials thing again, every project I do, pretty much, like all last week, I spent all last week buying trees, exotic trees, most of them palm trees, and traveling. I traveled all over Hellingham. We flew, made 4 flying trips and driving up into the mountains to buy these trees. Now, I have an idea what I want the tree to look like. I have an idea why I'm looking at this or seeking out this particular tree. But I wouldn't buy a tree without bringing along a real arborist, a real tree expert, Right. Because I could buy some bad trees that would die on me, Yeah, right. And the point is this, that now in these situations, I'm obviously over my head all the time, okay? And the talent you have to have in a way is to find a Jeff Jameson, mm-hmm. to find, like the tree guy I have, is spectacular. This guy not only knows the tree, he knows the whole history of trees. Mm-hmm. He knows, like one particular tree that he was recommending was what are they? God.
Is it
it's famous in the South. big white blossoms.
Magnolia?
Magnolia.
Yeah.
The reason why he wanted magnolia is that magnolias are the first flowering plant
Very early, yeah.
in the history of the earth. You know?
Oh, I thought even in spring they flower pretty early.
Well, no, it's not that. No, they're the earliest flowering plant on
really?
Earth.
Huh.
Before that, there were no flowering plants. We have plants that are cycads in this thing that were the first plants on Earth. They pretty much covered the whole Earth. The reason for that is that this whole project I'm doing is in a thing called the La Brea tar pits. And there's this phenomena of this tar bubbling up out of the earth. And they keep finding saber-toothed tiger bones. And I mean, it's just continuously bringing up all these things. It's been there it's a unique site in the world. It is this primal situation, you know, this totally primal thing of the earth still oozing and what have you. And so that everything in this thing, palm trees because of one of the first trees ever, a very primal tree, very different than every other kind of tree. They're not the same. They don't grow the same way. They don't function the same way. But everything in this project has that kind of primal quality. I'm using, found this place in Washington where there's what are they now? Six-sided. There's a place called the Devil's Pile Post.
Okay.
What are they called? I can't think.
Is it a flowering shrub? Is it
No. It's stone.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. It's one of the geological wonders of the world, in which these things.
It's a mineral.
It's the entire. You cut off the earth, and there's just these 35, 40-foot posts, six-sided posts sticking up, just like this.
Right.
Incredible. So I found those, and so I'm putting all that. So I have to find a man who really knows where that kind of sort of thing is, how we can harvest them, who you harvest them from, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like an adventure story. Every project, I'm like, in this project, I had to find these. I'm finding these stones. I'm finding these trees, these incredible trees, et cetera. And so the point being is that at a certain point, I am essentially on a continuous learning curve, and I find people that can take me on that learning curve, take me on that trip. But there's no way I'm going to know everything they know. And then when I take a project like that and I go to the field, when we actually go into the field, the man who's going to set them, he'll start telling me about how the different methods for setting them. Right. Or a guy, I'm going to do some metal work in there using Corten steel. Right. The Corten steel guy will tell me how to weld it and what the different options are in that. And so I actually then, when he tells me that, then I go back and rethink how I'm going to make it.
A kind of response to that.
Based on what he's telling me is the honesty of this material. This is how this material works. This is its properties. These are what you can do. These are what you can't do. These are things that in a sense make no sense with the material. Here's the things that really do. And so I rethink the whole thing based on that. It's like another kind of input. It has to do with the honesty of the material, the straightforwardness of the material, and being in kind, not trying to pretend it's something else or trying to make it into some faux or fake thing. Right. So it's a great kind of activity which is continuously interactive. Information's coming in all the time. The handicap people say you can't do this, so suddenly you have to rethink that. The steel guy says, well, you can't hook stuff up this, and you can't weld stuff under these conditions, blah, blah, blah. Right. Or if you make this steel right and you're going to bring grass right up to it, it probably won't work because this piece of steel is facing south. It'll get a lot of sun, build up heat, it'll burn the grass. You wouldn't even know that it would, but it'll transfer the heat to the soil, and the grass will die. Stuff like, and so suddenly I can't use grass, and what am I going to use? You have to sort of replan the thing. So it's a kind of like a long-running adventure, but in terms of what you're saying, there's a whole thing about materials and the honesty of materials. And so I spend a lot of time in the field with people that make things, people that are craftspeople. One of the things I take some pride in, and Jeff calling you yesterday is a perfect example, is that when that welder does a perfect, I ask him I want a perfect one. The guy who's building a bridge doesn't need a perfect weld, but I need a perfect weld. So the guy does it, they bring their family to the opening, because basically they are craftspeople. Most of the time they're not being asked to work on a certain level, but they can do it. And suddenly somebody says, at first you're kind of a little irritated, this is too much work, and blah, blah, and then they get into it, and their pride comes into play, and they really enjoy it.
Right.
So there's an overlap with what you do and what I do in that sense.
Along this sort of same thought process, one of the things that I'm thinking about is playing out this scenario that, say, in 30 years from now, I'm not here, you're not here. We need to make some decisions about this piece. And so, for example, it's not unthinkable that we're going to have a tough time finding 2-foot fluorescent bulbs that are around 5,500 Kelvin, or 4-foot bulbs that are around.
There's no doubt about it. They're going to phase them out pretty quick. They're going to go to what's called a T8. These are T12s.
Much more narrow.
Much narrow, would be more energy saving, etc. And
less mercury content.
They won't be around. So you're going to probably have to stockpile these.
One of the things we're going to do is buy as many of these lights as that we can feasibly purchase and store, in the same way with the scrim material. And maybe it's not a worthwhile exercise, but I wonder if you could play out the thought, is that what if we couldn't get the T12 bulb? Is there another kind of thing that we could put there?
I don't know the answer to that, but I have a riddle for you that it puts it into context of when the abstract expressionists painted their paintings. Let's say Franz Klein, zoom, 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 using the kind of materials that he used in that. Art historians were, on one level, really pissed off, because they said, oh, this paint, it's in 50 years or whatever, it's just all going to peel off, okay? It's not going to last. Going back to, like to say, to a time when people did egg temperas, built on, that stuff was made to last as long as possible. And people cast things in bronze, made to last as long. And it's not an accident that they did that. At that point in time, one of the thrusts of art, one of the concepts that people were really entertaining in their religions in their life, was this idea of transcendence. The idea that it transcended our death, it transcended our time. And we have built this entire concept of history based on this idea of this transcendence, which is a very beautiful idea. And in religions, it's like heaven and hell, and an afterlife, and etc. These are comforting ideas, and they're in a sense a rather beautiful idea of an ideal art. If you look at the history of art, it's never stood still. All those methods, all those techniques, as good as they were, as brilliant as they were, somehow didn't make sense in the next generation and the generation after that. So we've come to a point where, say, Franz Klein does this thing, and one can say, well, it's not going to last the way those other things lasted. And he's basically saying it's not supposed to last. It's not about transcendence. Is a wonderful, beautiful idea, but it's not real. It's not the world we really live in. We live in a world that's in constant change and constant flux, and chances are we don't transcend in any way, and our mark on the earth doesn't transcend. Now, that's something we can debate philosophically and what have you, but there's an honesty in that material having to do with, it's like when I did the garden. I could have looked at all the gardens in the world. There's incredible gardens. But if you look at each one of those gardens, they represent a point of view about man and nature. The French garden, the Italian garden, the English cottage garden. And these are really not just gardens. They are philosophic treatise on how people,
move in space, and how all these
they
things.
understand who they are and what they are, And so the issue for me was, if I'd have looked at those gardens, I'd have been overwhelmed by them, because they're spectacular. So I took the gamble to be naive and to try and do a garden based on the issues that I've been talking about here, this conditionalist and that. And with the idea that maybe it would be the first 20th, 21st century garden that represents a different aesthetic, a different set of values, a different idea about reality, about meaning, and so on and so forth. So, and when you get to that, without going into length, that's what art's about. And art really, in a sense, is as close to philosophy as there is, because it doesn't have a function in the critical sense the way an architect does. I mean, architecture has a function, and in fact, a lot of what's going on in architecture now is really, in a sense, unethical. I mean, they build museums now that you can't use as a museum. That's unethical. I mean, it's built for a reason. It has a component of it about aesthetics. It has a component about in a sense, representing points of view, a courthouse as opposed to an outhouse. You know what I mean? There's a difference in them. And the process of being an architect is a very tough thing to do, to take all that into consideration, take all the practicalities into consideration, all the codes and so on and so forth, and the fact that somebody has to live in there and put them together. And when it does, it's a spectacular thing to do. But art doesn't have that. Art, in a sense, is a continual inquiry into the potential of human beings to perceive and know the world with an aesthetic bias. And so art, in a sense, is what we see as the art world, which is not art per se. It is the process of how art is being innovated into the world and corrupted at the same time. This is not an either or better than proposition. If without this process of the art world doing what it does, well or not well, the inquiry of art would be like the tree that falls in the forest, has no effect. So the act of art is this inquiry about the potential of human beings, but everything from that point is something else. It has to do, and so this whole idea about making histories, which has been very crucial, and worked when the object was, and it had a kind of permanence, transcendence about it. You set up a museum and you take the position of trying to maintain it in perpetuity. The beauty of that is the idea that it creates this record, this body of knowledge from which the world steps off, and we have that as a reference point.
I think all the folks that work in an institution really take that, take that point to heart and really try to.
But one of the problems is now is in contemporary art that basically it won't hold still for that. It's creating but on one hand that's a problem, but at the same hand it asks a set of questions that are unbelievably magical. How would we make a history? You can't photograph it. It doesn't really do it. It's all experiential, requires the presence of you there. I can talk about it. We can make, films, so and so.
Photographs, notes.
Photographs are with no better or worse. They're a product of the object form of thinking. In other words, they really are a sign system. They have a certain amount of tactile quality, but basically they're a series of signs, and symbols, and images which we read as a figure and etc. and what have you. When you take that out, then the question becomes, how do you make a history? I mean, the art historians right now are in an unbelievably interesting point of view because all their methodology doesn't really work right now. I mean, for example, this one now is semi-permanent, okay. But it may be for like 50 years not everything I did, which we'll assume for a minute was art, none of it exists. For me, someone says, whoa, wow, isn't that a problem? Yeah, it is, but it's also an amazing question. It doesn't exist. We're talking about an entirely different concept about museums, or a concept about how one goes about playing this aesthetic games. Right now, I don't know the answer to it. None of us do. But the whole import of modern art ultimately has to do with this idea of the phenomenal. And we can't, in a sense, hold the phenomenal still or in our hand.
What's interesting to work at an institution that is beginning to develop a conservation science department and be in touch with other departments or other institutions that have conservation science departments. I'll bet that there's folks out there that are working on ways, for example, to re-adhere Franz Klein's paintings. Is to from a scientific perspective, try to hold time still. In the same way, you can imagine, again, this 30 years from now.
Let me give you a simple proposition.
Okay.
You could paint a painting, would be the most spectacular painting imaginable, or absolutely everything you would want a painting to be, but it's going to fall apart. Or you can paint a painting which is okay, not bad, but will last for a long time.
Right.
You have a choice,
yeah.
Okay? Yeah. But it's a real set of, it's a choice of values, right. A choice of meaning, a choice of defining who you are in the world and that. So it's not, when artists do these kind of things, they're not incidental. We're dealing with issues about the nature of human beings in the world and our concepts of meaning and et cetera and so on and so forth. That's what makes it an interesting activity, is that a lot of what I do, I don't know the answer. In fact, the movie on me is called The Beauty of Questions. At one point I became a question addict. It's not about answers. Yeah. In philosophy, the beauty of philosophy is that it's not about answers. It's about the wonder of asking and moving forward in the world, re-examining what we think and why we think it and that sort of thing. Makes it a really different kind of activity. And when one makes an object, you're not really making the object as much as you are honing your own sensibility to make the object, your ability to decide and make the choices and so on and so forth. And you do that for 50 years or 60 years, you get pretty good at it after a while, because that's what you're really working on. People think it's all about this. It's really about this, and that's a result of this, okay? They get it kind of backwards. The idea that communication is what art is about. It's not about communication. It's about knowing. Communication, if it's not about knowing, then basically what we're putting out there is just, drivel.
Well, you're certainly, I mean, you're setting up some wonderful challenges for conservators.
Also, we're in the interim here, and that's really where we are now.
Right.
We're in the middle of, in a sense, going through a change in which all the old methodologies are on shaky ground.
Right.
I mean, there's a guy named Jack Brogan that I've worked with for years. I mentioned to him before. This guy is a fountain of information for all the kinds of stuff are being made. It's not being taught in school. It's not, there are the science of this. One of the places you have to go is to people like Brogan or like that welder that did that,
Right.
They can tell you how it can be done
Right.
or if it can be done, or what. Some of these things won't even be around. I mean, Corten steel is, I've used, say, for example, simple, obvious material, but it wasn't successful in architecture, and so now to get it, you have to special order it, Same thing with these tubes. They're just liable to go right out of business.
So
we can prepare for the next 50 years, say,
So can I be comfortable with the idea? Maybe it's a question. Maybe.
I don't know what you can be comfortable with.
What this institution can do is to try as long as it can to get the materials that this consists of.
Of course, that's the best you can do.
And there may be a day when it can no longer get those.
And that's the way it is.
And that's the way it is.
Right. But by that time, somebody else will have made something just as good or better, and certainly something more relevant, probably.
Some other artist.
Yeah. The thing is that when you look at the history of art, it has continually changed, okay? Continually changed, never stood still. Everybody reinventing the medium, reinventing the format, reinventing this place, reinventing the questions and so on. It's going on all that time, all right? But so in a sense, all these things before no longer are relevant in a sense. But this thing is doing this, but it's not in a sense lost in any way. I mean, if you stay on the cusp of the question, you're really actually where it's about. All this is about history, and history is a very valuable thing. But how we make histories, in a sense, can't dictate how we make inquiries. Okay, there has to be a reciprocation there. Right. There has to be a relationship there, and that relationship is having to change. I mean, the first time I took a painting to New York, they hated him, and one of the reasons they hated him is because I cleaned the wall. There was a hole in the wall. I patched the hole up. There was a baseboard like that, and I did this thing, and the baseboard became a part of the painting in some way, because I was taking on that whole wall. So they thought I had an excessive potty training, some kind of anal anxiety, and they couldn't understand why I would do that.
Right.
I did it because I could see it. Stella and I had a dialogue one time. He asked me why I finished the edge of my painting so carefully. I said, because it's important. He was doing these octagonal paintings like this with a hole in the middle, quite famous, good paintings. And he just pulled the canvas around and tack it, okay? Very simple, straightforward, honest. And I asked him why he didn't deal with that, right, in this case, right in the middle of the painting, not just to the, right in the middle. He said, because it's not important. I mean, in a sense, he didn't see it. I saw it.
Right.
Not a matter of good or bad, but once I saw it, I had to deal with it. After we had that dialogue, he started stretching them more neatly. He never went where I went, but he he cleaned it up because I had pointed it out to him. But it has to do with it. I stopped being a painter in the original sense, not because I didn't like painting. I love being a painter. I love being in the studio. But at a certain point, I no longer could confine my eye to that frame. I started seeing things here, there, and everywhere that were more interesting. And I thought, how do I get that? I mean, that's beautiful. How do I get that in my work, Right. So I had to reinvent the medium. Now, each of these arts, at each of these moments in time, is art, but none of them is art per se. the idea of an ideal art or a transcendent art, see, had the idea that at some point you would do an art that was the answer for all time. But actually, in fact, what we have is each one of them perfectly represents their moment in time, which is the crux of their art.
It's right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right now. And it becomes a whole different world, a whole different set of issues, a whole different set of values. I mean, because the game that we're playing here is a value game, about values, about our personal values, and how we are influenced. We come in the museum, to some degree, theoretically, we should walk out with some understanding of those values, and we apply them to our lives. Changes the world. That's the way art works in the world. Right. You know, it doesn't stand on corners and hand out leaflets. Yeah. I'm not a Christian, you know, proselytizing, but I am essentially, in a way, acting out a way of looking, a way of knowing, a way of seeing, and pointing out that human beings are really quite spectacular, and that our perceptual mechanism is almost unfathomable. Most of the people in biology and mind research and that are still trying to resolve the issue of the human consciousness to some kind of quantitative set of measurements, okay? Right. Dead wrong. They're never going to happen.
A lot of paperwork.
There's a quantitative facet to us. There is a qualitative facet. And one of the key elements of modern art is the idea that certain things don't exist, values, in a sense, qualities don't exist without a human being to actually stand there and act on them and keep them in play. So we try and quantify them. One of the ways, for example, there's this thing called design. Design is an attempt to quantify proper, the golden mean, certain proportions, certain colors like to act together and that. All that's very useful, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the process of perceiving the qualities of these things. Yeah. Okay? We're in a very interesting moment in time. This revolution has been going on for 200 years, and we're only at the halfway point. We don't even know if it's going to work yet, or what kind of world it's going to make. So being an artist right now is like you have to roll the dice.
Right. Well, not that I necessarily came to this looking for some kind of comfort, but I think that the way that you've explained it does help to me to understand what my role is and what the institution's role is, and to maintaining and preserving this as we can.
Listen, your interest and your dedication to this thing is really important. You know, it's a piece and a part of it. Like I said, when the thing goes in the world, like for example, those things, none of them existing for 50 years, creates a real problem, a real issue. Here's one that's here, and it's important that it be here for a while.
Yeah. It's just starting its life.
Got a job to do for a while. Yeah. Not an infinite job necessarily, but a job.
Well, I thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.